the fact that there is a strong formal training, but also that it is a small, very interactive environment, and that is rare.
The stuff we're doing is actually very relevant for policy work. A lot of our alumni now work actually at the European Commission.
In a way, we are carrying on a tradition that predates the Institute itself. In fact, even one of the fathers of modern economics, Vilfredo Pareto, wrote here several chapters of the Manual of Political Economy.
I think there's something about this room which brings you in a good mood for having a conversation like this today.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And for me, it's like a little bit like stepping back in time. The first time I was in this building and in this library was many years ago, in the late 80s, so you were probably not even born. And this was when I was an undergraduate student in economics, and I was desperately looking for books and papers for my master thesis. And I remember this sense of wonder when I arrived here in these beautiful villas around the Florence hills, full of researchers and people from all over Europe. This is really something that I had never experienced in the usual Italian academia.
It's crazy, we know you for so long now and we didn't even know that you've been here as a student already.
Yes, not as a student of the EUI, but as a student at the University of Florence. Again, as an undergraduate student in economics first, and then as a PhD student in statistics. And in fact, I was attending some of the econometric seminars here at the EUI, and I was always impressed of how easy it was, even then, to approach and interact with senior professors. And in fact, it was one of the professors then, John Michelwright, who pointed me to a microeconometrician in Cambridge, UK, who then became my mentor and collaborator for many years.
Oh, well, that's super nice.
Yes,
but
it's
and
nice
also it's nice
indeed.
that openness that you just mentioned, and that was there decades ago, is still the defining feature of the department, no? We sit down with professors, with researchers, whenever, to have a conversation about ideas, or whenever I felt lost, I needed some guidance. People were there, they were accessible, and there is this kind of intergenerational agreement for which if someone needs some help, you are there for them in the same way they have been helped before.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. It's crazy. When I speak with my friends from other programs, I really feel like how generally different the EUI is compared to other econ programs worldwide, I think, because we have such a strong connection with the faculty and between different cohorts. And for example, a few days ago, I was just having a coffee outside in the garden, and then my supervisor passed by and I just mentioned a half-formed idea that I had, and then 20 minutes later we ended up in her office drawing some graphs on pieces of paper and like thinking and brainstorming how to work on it together. And I think this is a very unique feature, and this is really what makes the EUI for me.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know exactly what it is, if it's the scale, the setting, the fact that we have lunch all together in the same canteen, but there is something about this place that is really special. I guess if you put together 100 PhD researchers and a bunch of, actually not very many, but some professors in a nice, beautiful villa far enough from the city, where there is nowhere near to have lunch, essentially something magic happens.
No, I think it's all the feature that you just mentioned. I remember myself when I was applying to the PhD program, I could see this from outside. And what drew me here was indeed the fact that there is a strong formal training, but also that it is a small, very interactive environment, and that is rare.
Yes, and indeed the program, the PhD program, was structured since the very beginning to compete with major PhD program in the US. In fact, maybe you do not know or are not aware that the PhD programs in Italy only started and were designed and in the early 80s. And this was when the EUI had already run for almost a decade. And in fact, it was in the 90s that people like Ramon Marimon and others further gave the program even more structure with an intense first year of coursework, followed by intense research activity, as in a serious PhD program. And at that time, nothing like this existed, at least on this side of the Atlantic, maybe with very few exceptions in the UK.
And they succeed in it, no? Because, I mean, if you look at the rankings, the EUI Eco Department is 14th across all the economic institutions worldwide in terms of record publication of its graduate students.
Yes, and indeed this is something really, nice, given that the department has always been rather small in terms of faculty. But what it lacked in size, it made up in intensity. So this is really a place where ideas can circulate, and has always been a very fertile environment for new ideas and also collaborations.
Yes, and I think it goes even beyond just like academic publications, but there's this one sentence that my supervisor Giacomo Calzolari likes to say a lot, and I think it fits quite well in this setting and like in this conversation. He always says, from the blackboard to Brussels. And in the end, that's exactly what we're doing. We have like a very abstract model in mind, or like we think about how a market is actually designed and how it works, and then out of this comes a proper policy debate later on. So like the stuff we're doing is actually very relevant for policy work, and a lot of our alumni now work actually at the European Commission, for example.
Yes, and indeed this policy dimension has always characterized the department. I think by now we can count between 10 and 30 alumni working at each of several institutions around not only Europe but the world. So IMF, the European Central Bank, the World Bank, the European Commission, the Bank of England. And actually, Michele, you can tell us a little bit more about your experience at the Bank of England, because it's not only about alumni, but also our researchers are connected to these institutions.
Yeah, no, last year I had a nice opportunity to go at the Bank of England and the Norges Bank for 2 different research internships, and it was super nice. And I think it was also nice that I kept running into EUI alumni. And I think we share a kind of common way of thinking, which, and I think I can use maybe the words of Giancarlo Corsetti to describe it, which is competing for intellectual achievements, but collaborating in everything else. And I think when I think about it, this is like the EUI eco spirit, and it's something really nice.
Yeah,
yes.
It is
and
nice.
I think the policy dimension is also very clear when you look at the history of the econ department. I mean, you remember that we worked on this genealogy tree this year together for the 50th anniversary. And there we looked into like the past of the department and which professors has been working here. And you can really see that there was already this policy dimension from the beginning onwards, and people, professors and also students were working on European policy topics even before the EU was already founded. I'm thinking about Michael Artis here, for example.
Artis was indeed the chair of the scientific committee for the pilot program on the euro that took place, essentially was run over these hills in Fiesole.
No, that's true. And also it's nice that from these roots, macro at EUI became something really distinctive. You know, I'm thinking about all the work that has been done on quantitative macro, on international real business cycle, on European economic policies. I'm thinking about those professors that have been here long, and that they came even back, like Ramon Marimon with his work on learning and dynamic contracts, Russell Cooper, who is actually one of my two supervisors, and I know him the most for his work on empirical, on applied macroeconomic theory, I would define it, and Giancarlo Corsetti, whose work on the international real business cycle became the backbone of the first generation of models at the first generation of global economic model at the IMF.
Yes, and this is really and precisely the point. And also we do research that is policy relevant. Our researchers end up working in these institutions, and they bring this way of thinking with them. So this is very nice.
No, yeah, I think it's also nice that you can see that the training that we have here has an impact in several directions, both in terms of academic, because you have alumni that push the frontier, such as Klaus Adams with his work on rationality and asset pricing, or, for example, Florin Bilby, who was working on tank model when everyone else was working on representative agents. And but what is also really nice is the fact that what you learn, I mean, you're here and you're doing research here, you learn to do research here. But then these tools that you learn here, they're useful beyond academia. They're useful they're used in order to answer policy questions. And there is a plethora of alumni out there doing this. And for example, I'm thinking now about Michele Herman, who is now the head of the division of the Monetary Policy Research Division at the ECB.
Yes, and now that we are talking about macro, I think we cannot avoid talking about the time series analysis tradition at the Eco Department at the EUI, with all the work on co-integration by, for example, Johansen, but also the macroeconometrics of Marcellino. And this thread continued over the decades and has now been renewed also with Barbara Rossi.
Yeah, that's true. Barbara Rossi is also your supervisor, right, Michele? So I think this is very connected to your own research.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm working on, I think, in a bit between what we just mentioned, in applied macro. Mm-hmm. And I have projects that share the common method, but they span in several directions. I have one that works, that deals with exchange rate, that looks at exchange rate in order to analyze the propagation mechanism of monetary policy. Another one in which you look at flows in and out of the labor force in Norway. And then, I mean, actually we also had some chats now because I'm also interested in causality, the causality framework in time series. But I can see that what we did here at EUI is connected to my research, because there are some of the key papers in my literature that are done by people affiliated to our department. I'm thinking about Karel Mertens and Morten Ravn, which met here because one was the supervisee and the other one was the supervisor. And I even actually follow a summer school by Karel in my first year. So I think that speaks for itself.
Very nice. And Julia, instead your research is more on the micro theory side. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit on the tradition in micro theory, but also on your own research.
Yes, of course. So I would say, also after Michele kind of revised the macro tradition, that micro theory is a bit different. Like, we're not so much divided into different fields or topics. It's more like micro theory at the EUI kind of evolved with the time. So I think in the beginning, like the first professors and researchers that worked here on micro theory were very game theory heavy, and general equilibrium methods were used a lot. And this kind of moved forward to more modern topics. Like right now we have huge professors here in industrial organization and also in market design. I think this really shows what micro theory at the EUI is about. Like, the idea is to try to always understand how a market works, and then the policy dimension is how should we design it, or how can we interfere to make it better. And I think one of the most influential books that were written were in competition policy were from Massimo Motta. Actually, I have the book also here. And he wrote a very influential book, and he was here in the early 2000s, and I think he was like one of the starting factors that we moved more into the direction of industrial organization, which is right now one of the biggest fields here in microtheory.
And this is that closer to your research, no?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my own research, I look at how countries try to transition to electric mobility, and there I look into the interaction between actually electric vehicle sales and the investment into charging infrastructure, because these two markets are very interdependent with each other. And most models out there look just at a static environment, and what I'm doing is kind of to look how different access regimes and how different market structures affect the investment incentives in a dynamic setting, and kind of show. And my goal is to find out which policy would be optimal to enhance this take-up of electric vehicle deployment, and also to exactly to find a subsidy scheme that kind of makes you invest into more charging stations.
So economic model really become a way of thinking about the real world.
Exactly. I think my own research is a good example, but also everything else that's done in microtheory at the moment. We use these tools that are around for decades already, but we always apply them to new questions, to new market. For example, most people I know at the EUI work on digital markets and artificial intelligence, algorithmic pricing. So all these topics that are very relevant nowadays, but using these tools which are around for a long time, which we have a very strong training in.
Yes, and I think this is also true for microeconometric theory and methods. Methodological research here at the EUI always starts from an applied problem. And in fact, this type of applied microeconometric research has a lot of connections and has always been very close to the credibility or causality revolution that arrived here at the EUI long before anywhere else in Europe, or at least continental Europe, I would say. And in fact, it was Andrea Ichino came here from MIT, where he had a lot of connections and overlapped with Josh Engrist. And so in the early 90s, Andrea was already teaching the whole toolkit of modern microeconometrics at a time when these books that we have here today, so most the harmless econometrics and also the book on causal inference by Imbens and Rubin did not even exist. So this was really nice.
It was not just Ichino, no? You, Angrist and Imbens are also a bit connected to the department, even from before.
Yeah, I was teaching then, or maybe a little bit later in the early 2000 courses on causal inference to both undergraduate and graduate students in statistics, and those courses were really new. There was nothing like that being taught in Europe at that time, and they also were a result of my collaboration with Don Rubin. Also, Engrist and Imbens were visiting the department then, and also taught short courses on the topics. And so researchers were naturally exposed very early to all these methods and that influenced then the way empirical research has always been conducted here at the EUI.
And what are you working on at the moment?
Yes. So as you know, I specialize and I care a lot about causality and causal effect, and so my research is around causal inference methods, and at the moment I have several projects. The two that I like most are one on estimating essentially causal effects in settings with interference and spillover effects, essentially when people interfere or are organized over a network, like a social network. And another one, a little bit more applied, is on the evaluation of AI or algorithm-assisted human decisions. So both are in fact projects that are also at the intersection of micro behavior and aggregate effects. So very nice to see how ideas and also topics are interrelated, and I think the EUI is a very nice place to discuss around these topics.
Fabrizia, could you also say something about women economics, especially at the EUI?
What I'm proud of also regarding the department and the whole climate that there is there is the fact that we have now a strong representation of women in the faculty, and especially in fields within economics where women have always been even more underrepresented. So this is the case with econometrics, but also micro theory. So this is very nice to see, and also the fact that our alumni are really shaping the field or their fields in top institutions.
And I feel like recently it's not only about representation, but actually also about conversation about these gender-related topics. What comes to my mind is the Gender Talk series, which started in 2023 and kind of came from the fact that Claudia Goldwyn back then won the Nobel, and we had a seminar on her work, and then out of this there was a lot of support from the faculty to build this Gender Talk series where speakers come from all different fields, so macro, applied econometrics, and also micro theory, that do work that is gender related and talk about gender issues. And these talks are very well visited. There's not only women going there, but like everyone is very invited, and you can really see that this helps also with gender related topics, that there's an academic discussion about it. And for me personally, since I come from a background where women were very underrepresented, the EUI feels very different, and I feel very comfortable here by seeing, for example, you as the head of department, or my supervisor who's also a woman, and working with her and being supported by her feels very different. And I think that's something even nowadays that you cannot take for granted, and I'm very grateful for this at the EUI.
Yes, and if I can say also something a little bit more personal now that we are towards the end of our conversation. You know, being the first woman to lead the Department of Economics at the EUI is something that I do not take lightly. It matters a lot, and I hope it signals also to the new generations that this place is really and genuinely open. It was also very nice to see, and it is nice to see, that the program has grown and it's double in size with respect to 1976. And I also think that all the features that we have highlighted and in our conversation, namely the close supervision, the policy reach, the intense or the intellectual intensity of the place, are really features that have defined and characterized the department. And I hope, and I'm sure, that the same features will shape the future of the department, as well as the future of researchers like you two who will pass through it. And let me also say that in a world that is changing so fast, I think that rigorous economic thinking is needed now, possibly more than ever.